I'm Kate Ritchie and this is APENG News. Today we're talking about the Victorian era, or Queen Victoria's reign over Great Britain, which was the longest reign as a British monarch from 1837 to 1901. This was a time of peace and prosperity, only interrupted momentarily by the Crimean War. Many influences during this time were imperialism and the Industrial Revolution. Now, imperialism exposed writers to other ideas and themes that sprouted outside of Europe. The Industrial Revolution brought great advances in science and technology, which brought on the battle between science and religion. Some other themes during this time were moralization, order, heroism, and individuality. This also marked the rise of literature as a form of entertainment. Furthermore, the Victorian era was a transition between Romanticism and realism. Romanticism focused on self and self-improvement, human flaws, and nature. Realism focused on the daily life of those in Europe and the harsh reality that was portrayed during that time. Now we go to Catherine for our next segment.
Thanks, Kate. Our first poet today is Alfred Lord Tennyson. He's one of the most popular poets of this time period, so popular, in fact, that he became poet laureate under Queen Elizabeth's court. He excelled in writing short lyrics and blank verse, and his poems contain a wide range of subject matter, from classic mythology, such as in Ulysses, to current events, such as in The Charge of the Light Brigade. He was influenced by John Keats and other Romantic poets, and this influence can be seen in his rich imagery and descriptive writing. His greatest influence to literature is his masterful use of rhythm to create any desired mood. Now moving on to Alyssa.
Thanks, Catherine. I'm Alyssa Ortega, and I'll be introducing the Browning couple. Elizabeth Barrett Browning was one of the most prominent English poets of the Victorian era and part of the Romantic movement. She was influenced by Alfred Lord Tennyson, William Wordsworth, and several other poets. By 1830, she gained attention for her work, The Seraphim, which expressed Christian sentiments in the form of a classical Greek tragedy. Many of her works carries a Christian theme, and by 1844 she produced a collection entitled Poems, which gained the attention of Robert Browning. After several months of exchanging letters, they eloped to Italy together. There she wrote her best work, Sonnets from the Portuguese, which was dedicated to Robert. Robert Browning was an English poet, playwright, and master of dramatic monologue. His work contained themes such as religion, beauty, delusion, and death. His greatest influence was his wife, Elizabeth, and despite the success of his first work, his second work, Sordello, failed, and he was labeled as obscure. This would haunt his reputation and work for the rest of his life. Only after Elizabeth died, he was able to achieve success with The Ring and the Book, which is what made him famous. Now on to Kate.
Another writer of this time was Charles Baudelaire. He was born in 1821 and is considered one of the most controversial writers of his time. He was admitted to law school at a young age, but was ultimately dissatisfied by this profession. He fell into drinking and spending money on prostitutes and things like that. His father had sent him to India in order to suppress these dark, depressing feelings. Ultimately, this backfired because he came back with another woman in a relationship and was ultimately rejected by his father, sending him to commit suicide. But he didn't. In 1845, he published his first writing, which defined him as an advocate for Romanticism. He kind of marked that transition from Romanticism to realism. In 1857, he had written his first volume of poems called Les Fleurs du Mal, or The Flowers of Evil. He also wrote translations for Edgar Allan Poe. A lot of themes in his books were death, sex, depression, urban corruption, loss of innocence, and alcohol. These were not accepted by society, but represented the emerging individualistic ideals during this time. And now to our next segment on another author.
My name is Sophia Ragosa, and another great author of the Victorian era is Charles Dickens. He was an English writer and social critic that was very popular during his time, and by the 20th century was known as the literary genius. Despite having a lack of formal education, he persevered by editing a journal, writing several novels, novellas, short stories, and non-fiction articles. With the publication of The Pickwick Papers, his first novel, his success began in 1837. A friend of his, John Forster, influenced many of his novels by editing the drafts and giving input on plot and characters. The social criticism within his novels was considered some of the greatest of the Victorian era. Now on to another great author. Our next writer is Thomas Hardy. He was a novelist, poet, and short story writer. Although he referred to himself as mainly a poet, he became famous from his novels before any of his poetry was ever even published. He is most famous for his large volume of work, The Wessex Stories. As a realist, he was influenced by novels about evolution and Charles Darwin. Hardy would later greatly influence poets from the 1950s and 60s. Now on to Jean.
Thanks, Sophia. My name is Jean Go, and I'll be talking about Rudyard Kipling. So Kipling moved from England to India to support Great Britain's imperialism. What is imperialism? Events like the Spanish-American War and the Boer War influenced Kipling's writing to more colonial affairs. His two most famous poems are called The Recession and The White Man's Burden. These poems were warning to white men to consider Queen Victoria's reign with more humility and awe rather than pride and arrogance. To Kipling, white men were the people who lived in more developed nations. When he joined the British Army, he met Florence Garrard, and she was the inspiration for Macy in his novel The Light That Failed. The novel contains unstructured paragraphs just like most Victorian literature, and Kipling himself said that the novel is more of a conte and not a built book. What is a conte? The novel also depicts realistic scenes of Africa and the Orient, which were inspired by his own voyages. The last book is his most famous work, and it's a collection of short stories called The Jungle Book. The Jungle Book's theme of good versus evil and heroism is just like most books in the Victorian era. Now we have Catherine Nguyen talking about Oscar Wilde.
Thanks, Jean. The next writer is Oscar Wilde. Wilde is known for his wit and flamboyant personality. He wrote novels and plays such as The Importance of Being Earnest, but he's also famous for his epigrams. At the age of 41, evidence was found that proved him to be a homosexual, so he was imprisoned for gross indecency. This imprisonment triggered a shift in his subject matter, and it changed from pursuing pleasure to darker themes. Back to you, Jean.
Thanks, Catherine. Our last author for today is Joseph Conrad. Conrad's parents were Polish patriots who conspired against the Russian government. Because of this, they were arrested and sent to live in the Russian province. This early experience reflects a common theme in Conrad's writing, which is darkness. In fact, his most famous novel is called Heart of Darkness, and he intentionally made this hard to read and lengthy to parallel his fighting through a jungle when he was in the French army. Imperialism is prevalent, as native Africans in the novel were made to work through poor working conditions, and realism is portrayed as Conrad discovers the materialism of white men. Our next novel is Lord Jim, and just like the previous novel and most Victorian literature, he purposely made it confusing and lengthy by using juxtaposition instead of simple narrative and frequently changing the tenses. Lastly, heroism is depicted as the main character overcomes cowardice and becomes the leader of a small country. This concludes our news segment. I'm Jean Go, and this is APENG News.